Welcome to this Cardiff University Informing Policy webinar. This is the latest in our series of webinars where the university provides a space for academics to speak directly to policymakers on a variety of topics where their research can help inform policy development. Today's session looks at the new book, The Welsh Criminal Justice System on the Jagged Edge. Professor Richard Wyn Jones and Dr. Robert Jones discuss the Welsh criminal justice system and its unique position. Wales has its own devolved government and parliament, and yet there is no Welsh equivalent of the Scottish or Northern Irish justice systems. The extensive responsibilities of Wales's devolved institutions ensure that they necessarily play a significant role in criminal justice. As a result, the Welsh criminal justice system operates across a jagged edge of devolved and reserved powers and responsibilities. This book provides the first academic account of this system. It demonstrates not only that Wales has some of the worst criminal justice outcomes in Western Europe, but even if the will existed to address some of these problems, the current constitutional underpinnings of the Welsh criminal justice system would make it nigh on impossible. Based on official data and in-depth interviews, this is an urgent and challenging book, required reading for anyone interested in Welsh politics and society.
Hello everyone, I hope you can all hear me. I'm Martin Shipton, I work for the Western Mail, and it's my privilege to chair this discussion today, which is about a new book that has just been published by these two fine academics, Richard Wyn Jones, who is waving the book in the camera, and Rob Jones, both of Cardiff University. The book is called The Welsh Criminal Justice System on the Jagged Edge. Now, it's a good title because I think for those of us who take an interest in Welsh politics, we sometimes get things wrong. And I certainly took the view a few years ago when there was the latest Gestation of a Wales Act passed that said that the old system, where there was some doubt about which powers the then National Assembly had, was going to be cleared up by having a reserved system. So you would have a certain number of powers that were reserved to the UK government, and essentially everything else that wasn't on that list was going to be devolved to Wales. But as our two academic friends have demonstrated very clearly in the book that I read last week, and which you have the opportunity to read as well, that isn't the case at all, and things are really in a bit of a mess, which is why it's called the jagged edge of devolution, because anybody who thought that it was a sort of clear cut and clean cut between what was devolved and what isn't would be barking up the wrong tree. So without any further ado, I shall ask Richard and Rob to give a presentation. So Richard and Rob.
Okay, hiya, croeso, welcome. This is me, Richard, and I'm going to kick us off. I'm going to start with the title, actually. That might be the best place to start, and especially because Martin has kind of prepared the ground. To talk about a Welsh criminal justice system is to raise the spectre of something quite unfamiliar. I think we're very used to thinking about Wales in certain contexts. So, you know, there's sports, there's politics, people talk about a Welsh economy. We very, very rarely hear about a Welsh criminal justice system because we're so used to an England and Wales framing. And actually, even the and Wales element of that is a bit of a kind of, has a slightly modish feel to it, sort of, you know, political correct kind of thing. So most of the academics talk about England. They don't even, the and Wales doesn't exist for most academics. And here's a list of, you know, kind of standard references. And these are really well-known things in the field. It's an English prison system, an English penal policy, English probation system, English model of sentencing, English policing practices. The and Wales kind of completely disappears. What we want to argue, what we argue in the book, it is a central contention of the book. There is a Welsh criminal justice system that is and it's been created as an unintentional but unavoidable consequence of the devolution process. And it's distinct, it's not separate. We're not claiming it's like Northern Ireland or like Scotland, which are separate criminal justice systems. It is nonetheless a distinct Welsh system within the overall England and Wales framework. Why do we argue that? Well, even though the UK government has reserved formally policing and criminal justice, nonetheless, the responsibilities of the Welsh government extend right into the heart of the criminal justice institutions themselves. So the Welsh government does, for example, health and education within prisons. It plays a really large role in police funding. So you've got the Welsh government being really active in the actual criminal justice institutions. But on top of that, all the other kinds of areas of social policy on which the criminal justice system relies, all bar welfare. Welfare is the only big exception. Everything else, housing, health, education, substance misuse, local government, which is obviously plays a really important part. All of these things on which the criminal justice system relies, the criminal justice institutions rely, are devolved. And that means that the way that the criminal justice system in Wales works is distinct from anywhere in England. And of course, the Welsh government has got its own democratic mandate, its own policy preferences. It's actually its own approach to criminal justice. So there is a distinct Welsh criminal justice space. So that's the first bit of the title. The second bit of the title is this notion of the jagged edge. And I guess the point to make is that the division between reserved and devolved in the area of criminal justice is far from straightforward, as Martin was saying, far from being easily delineated. So what we say is that what defines actually this distinct Welsh criminal justice system is that it's constituted across a jagged edge of intersecting competencies and responsibilities shared between two governments, which, as I said, have different political priorities, embody different values, they're accountable through different electoral mandates. And to emphasize the point, and it's an unfamiliar point, so it's worth emphasizing, this makes criminal justice in Wales different from Scotland and Northern Ireland, obviously, where you've got devolved executives, devolved governments, devolved legislatures and devolved justice systems, all kind of aligned together, but also different from England, because in England you've got a UK government which is the government, you've got Westminster, and you've got an England and Wales criminal justice system, which is the jealously guarded preserve of that UK level. So it's the lack of alignment, it's the lack of constitutional alignment that makes the Welsh system distinct. It's also worth emphasising that it makes the Welsh situation very different from what you find in English regions, because you don't have anything in English regions that's equivalent to what you have in Wales in terms of the devolution of social policy, devolved government playing a central role in funding police and so on and so forth. And one of the things which makes the Welsh, from a kind of comparative study context, what makes it really quite striking is that there's nowhere in the world, certainly within the kind of Westminster model family, there's nowhere in the world where you'll find a parliament and a government without its own justice system, even at the regional level. So actually, we start the book by saying that the Welsh setup offends against one of the kind of basic principles of the Westminster model of parliamentary democracy, where you have, which is premised on the alignment of executive, legislature, and judiciary/justice system. And there are some really obvious in-principle problems with the way that it's organised in Wales because of this lack of alignment. So, you're introducing a lot of potential extra complexity. There's a really big question about, can you do joined-up policy in an area where you've got one government controlling some of the levers, another government with different political priorities controlling other levers. There's, criminal justice policy is notoriously complex and difficult to get right anyway. This is an area replete with what we call wicked problems which is very, very, very difficult to engage with. But, if you think about this in principle, the way that it's organised in Wales potentially makes joined up policy very difficult. There's also a big, big question about accountability. So who holds this system to account when you've got two governments and two different legislatures with this kind of really complicated division of responsibilities and powers? Who is holding this to account? So they're in principle problems. And I guess one way of understanding the book is we seek evidence to work out whether or not these in principle problems are actually there in practice. Have we found ways of correcting for these in principle problems, with coping with this, or do we in fact see these in principle problems being borne out in practice? And with this, I'll then hand over to Rob, who's going to start talking about outcomes.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Hopefully you can all see this now, which will help me a lot, because there are some visuals that I think will really help us to get across to you some of the things that we pick out in the book. So in chapter 2, we dedicate ourselves in the book to thinking about some of these outcomes. Having explained that there is a distinct set of arrangements in Wales, we then go on to think about, well, what about those? What do those arrangements look like? And in doing so, we encounter the first real challenge and problem of working in the Welsh system, and that is to actually access basic top-line data on what is actually happening in the Welsh criminal justice system. Disaggregated data are notoriously difficult to access, and that's something that we really put a huge amount of effort in to put this book together, is accessing that information. So one of the reasons we can posit there that it's actually unfamiliar to us, the operation of the Welsh criminal justice system is so unfamiliar, is because there is a distinct lack of data. Now, let us then try and put some kind of flesh on the bones. So what I want to try and do here is to think about the arc of the criminal justice process as best as possible. So from arrest, in a sense, all the way to the end of the system when people end up in prison. And we've just picked 5 to try and give a sense of things that we discuss in the book. So first and foremost, we can see from this figure here that police recorded crime in Wales, which is just one measure of recording crime, is relative to population lower in Wales than it is in England. Now, in a sense, I want you to kind of hold on to that thought for a moment. But that is the first thing we do. We take crime levels in Wales, we look at the Welsh context, and we discuss it. We draw upon the Crime Survey of England and Wales to add another dimension to that and to build up our analysis and understanding of this system, which Richard has already explained has emerged. Another set of problems we encounter, and I'm sure you're familiar with these in your own constituencies and communities, is that courts across Wales have closed almost en masse for the past decade. And you can see the 2 maps here illustrate that very, very clearly, what the landscape looked like in 2010 on the left-hand side there, and in 2019. This is something that featured in the Commission on Justice in Wales's report as well. So we can see that courts across Wales have closed, which raises all kinds of issues and questions around access to justice for people across Wales. I asked you to hold on to the thought about crime rates, and this is one of the reasons why, because here we encounter a peculiar problem in that, based on home address, so that helps us to determine people who are from Wales and from England, we can see that relative to population, so per 100,000 people, there are more people from Wales in prison for every year from between 2013 and 2019. We stopped the data process at 2019 because COVID gave us an opportune moment, in a sense, to pause, but that trend has continued in 2020 and 2021. So we have lower police recorded crime in Wales, but we see a higher rate of imprisonment. And that grey line you see at the top there is Wales's imprisonment rate, and it happens to be the highest rate of imprisonment in Western Europe. So these, again, when we unpick the Welsh level data, we can actually begin to understand and learn things about this system that has been obscured and masked within an England and Wales unit for decades and longer. Another major problem that we identify, or that we're able to identify when we access these data, is that there is clear evidence of racial disproportionality within the Welsh criminal justice system. You can see in this chart here that the rate of imprisonment and probation supervision per 10,000 people broken down by ethnic identity reveals a clear pattern of racial disproportionality and disparity. If we take the darker column there, which is the prison population, in 2019, for every 10,000 people in Wales who identify as Black, 91 were in prison. You compare that to 14 per 10,000 people who identified as white. These data, again, have only been accessed because of, or we can only uncover this story because we've accessed these data through freedom of information requests. And then finally, I think an important part of the story is that, well, you could argue that Wales has a higher prison population. Well, what does that tell us maybe about probation? Is that because there are fewer people on probation? The answer to that is no. There are more people in Wales relative to population under prison supervision and under probation supervision. And again, these three charts here reveal that very, very clearly. So what we actually do in this chapter is we reveal Wales. We show Wales for the first time in an academic context. And the picture we reveal and we uncover is a deeply troubling one. I think that's clear from the images that I've just shown you, and chapter 2, I think, does that in real devastating detail. Lower crime rates on our English neighbour, but perhaps higher rates of violent offences, something we go into in the book in a little more detail. Higher conviction rates emanating from a court system, which, as you've seen from that map, is increasingly physically inaccessible for large number of people across the country. So that's an important starting point, a springboard, if you like, for the book, for us to then go on and think about a range of other issues, which I'm going to talk about now before handing back to Richard. Firstly, let us think about the departments, the government departments at the UK level that are responsible for these issues. How do they take account of Wales? Where do these problems that we've just talked about rank in terms of priorities in Whitehall? So firstly, we focus on the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. These are the two key departments of government which oversee the England Wales criminal justice system. Just a note on methodology. We did 29 in-depth interviews and a focus group with 5 participants to help us really get at this question. Crucially, the people who help to navigate across the jagged edge, straddle the jagged edge on a daily basis, are the people whose accounts we have used to help formulate these arguments and ultimately these conclusions. Firstly, we encounter a problem, and that is that Whitehall is a very, very centralised government, or that these two government departments, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, are highly centralised. That is, there's a high concentration of staff in London. And what we do in chapter 3 is demonstrate that as clearly and as authoritatively as possible, again, drawing upon freedom of information data. So not only do we see that there are a high concentration of officials in Whitehall for the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, but we're talking about the senior officials. So those officials who are most likely to be in the ear of ministers, those people who are most likely to inform those discussions that set the trajectory of policy and legislation in Whitehall. We see that they are, more often than not, based in Whitehall, not based in Wales. So despite the existence of Wales-facing bodies like HMPPS in Wales, a Home Office team in Wales, they have very little policy-making influence or capacity. The power around the legislation and policy is in Whitehall, which of course is a huge problem for us in Wales when it comes to actually reflecting the unique Welsh context that we find. So the overall, or the overarching conclusion to chapter 3, of course I'm trying to do this in a couple of minutes, is that Wales counts for very little in Whitehall. We find that no matter how dedicated the professionals involved, they're simply engaged in a process of whack-a-mole, trying to deal with problems as they come up. I put there in brackets this issue of churn. Now we're talking about that at a fairly unfortunate moment, you might argue, given what is currently happening at the UK level. But the churn of ministers and officials presents a huge problem for this space. Being able to make sense of the Welsh context and actually having some strategic focus on what is happening in Wales is very difficult when you have new ministers and new officials on a very, very short-term basis. So having reviewed the way in which the Welsh Criminal Justice System or the England Wales Criminal Justice System use their dominant position, we have to confront that unpalatable truth, which is there in the title. Wales doesn't actually count for a huge amount in London. That won't come as a surprise to many of you, of course, who are long familiar with how Wales has been, and Welsh devolution has been dealt with in Whitehall. The second issue that I'd like to talk about now, and we have a whole chapter dedicated to this, is something a little bit closer to home. And that is the role of the Welsh government. And the quote you see there, "responsibility without power," is a paraphrase here of a quote from Aneurin Bevan, which is used to structure this particular chapter.
You want me to read it out, Rob?
Yeah, I usually tell you to. So yes, please.
Yeah. So this is imagine Aneurin Bevan with a North Wales accent. Responsibility without power is the most dangerous of all situations for a political party with progressive pretensions. So that's the quote which underpins this particular part of the discussion.
Yeah, and I think if I say so myself, I think it does it perfectly. Hence why we chose it, because although policing and criminal justice are formally reserved to the UK level, the Welsh government's responsibilities in this area, of course, are extensive. They cut right across almost every single policy area. We could sit here and list the many examples and in the book that we do, but the Welsh government is actively involved in lots of different policy areas that straddle policing and criminal justice. At the bottom there, you'll just see some examples. So the All Wales Youth Offending Strategy, working together to reduce harm, and more recently, the Female Offending Blueprint for Wales, and of course, the Youth Justice Blueprint for Wales. But despite the extent of the Welsh Government's responsibilities, we identify a problem, which is, in a sense, captured in that quote from Aneurin Bevan, that though its responsibilities are extensive, the key drivers and powers over this system, the criminal justice system, are not held in Wales. They are held, of course, at the UK level. So the major problem we detect is that the Welsh Government, despite their best efforts, despite their commitments to you can argue, a progressive approach to social policy, to tackling substance misuse, to helping homeless prisoners, to tackling the needs of children in contact with the criminal justice system, despite those progressive pretensions, it is the UK level that control the major drivers in this space, which renders the Welsh Government, we argue, as more of a policy taker than a policy maker. And in chapter 5, which I don't talk about here for the purposes of time, there are 2 case studies where we really lay this bare, and I think provide a lot more depth. I referred there to the example of the policy to help prisoners who are homeless. That is a very clear example of the perils involved in this situation, this jagged edge for the Welsh Government, even where it has a clear locus like housing. This poses us all kinds of questions around scrutiny, which I will now hand back to Richard, who will talk through these arguments.
Yeah, Rob. So the kind of lack of institutional alignment that I mentioned raises some really profound questions about who is scrutinising the Welsh criminal justice system, who is holding those people with power and responsibility to account. And the obvious danger when you kind of break the normal rules of the Westminster model, the danger is that nobody is holding it properly to account. And so what we do is we take a look at the mechanisms that operate at the England and Wales level, and then we look at what happens at the Welsh level. And we go into some detail. And again, there's a huge amount of detail in this book, and we are just skating over this very quickly. But broadly speaking, at the England and Wales level, the kind of key elements in terms of scrutiny and accountability are the select committees. So you've got the Justice Committee and the Home Affairs Committee, and then you've got the various inspectorates. And cutting a long story short, neither Home Affairs or Justice really engage with what's happening in Wales. The additional complexities and the additional kind of, Wales, the big questions are not in Wales, as we show in the book. When you talk to people working in the criminal justice system, knife crime in London or what's going on in the Greater Manchester police area, those are the big meaty issues. They tend to get the attention of the committees. And actually what's happened is it's been left to the Select Committee for Welsh Affairs. And I see Christina's there, and so I'm saying this with all due diffidence. The Select Committee of Welsh Affairs is not the most prestigious committee. They often struggle to find members for that committee. It's not a specialist committee in this area, and I think it shows you something about the priority accorded to what's going on in Wales, that it's not being taken on board by the select committees whose job it is to scrutinise the England and Wales system. And then you've got the inspectorates, and the story here is a little bit more nuanced. So the prisons inspectorate is probably the best in terms of engaging with Wales, but actually there's very, very little engagement with Wales from them either. What seems to be going on is it's seen as there's an additional layer of complexity in Wales because things are done differently in Wales. There's also a reluctance to reach over the jagged edge because, if you are doing a prison if you're inspecting Cardiff prison, and there's an issue with what happens to people leaving prison in terms of housing, you're entering devolved territory there, right? And there's a real reluctance to reach across the jagged edge. And the same point applies in terms of the Senedd. So the Senedd spends very, very, very little time looking at this stuff, in part because although the justice responsibilities at the devolved level are very extensive, they're scattered right across government, okay? And they're inevitably scattered across government, in my view, because, can you imagine the outrage in Westminster, Whitehall, if the Welsh government established a justice department, given that this is reserved, right? So the Senedd, and one of the things when we did research on attitudes, what we were told is, well, actually, that there's finite resources. It's probably, if you're going to do a report in an area where the Welsh government can actually do something, rather than spend your time on something where that actually you're very, very unlikely to have much of an impact. So on neither side of the jagged edge do you find these accountability mechanisms really engaging with the Welsh criminal justice system. And there are kind of understandable reasons, and they relate to the lack of alignment ultimately. And it's also the case that the other accountability mechanisms that you would expect to play a role are really absent. So we don't have in Wales things like the Howard League or focusing at the Welsh. These civil society organisations that do a great job, they just basically ignore Wales. The BBC have just got rid of their BBC Wales have just got rid of their Home Affairs correspondent for Wales. So there's very, very little media coverage except for what is generated, and I won't spare his blushes, by the work that Rob does. And then Rob produces reports and is picked up by journalists, but there's very little specialist attention being paid to this anywhere in civic society and civil society in Wales. Next, please, Rob. Which then leads to the question of the future. I mean, our conclusion, based on, you know, an extensive analysis, which we're just skating over, is that this is a structurally dysfunctional system. There are good people trying to do good things. You know, this is not an attack on the people involved, but structurally, this is set up in a way that, you know, is incredibly dysfunctional. All the in-principle problems that you would expect from ignoring the basic rules of the Westminster model are there in spades. So comparatively speaking, this is a system that performs very poorly indeed. And the outcomes, I mean, Rob just gave you just 3 or 4 tables. It's really very, very depressing. Working on this book was actually deeply depressing, just because, you know, the human cost that lies beneath these stats are just awful. It's a system in which effective policy making is rendered extremely difficult, even by the standards of a policy area that's very complicated and intractable. And actually, Rob mentioned the chapter 5, where there are 2 in-depth case studies. One is about the housing for ex-prisoners and the way that a flagship policy launched by the Welsh Government based on the best evidence, lauded by the inspectorates as best practice, collapsed effectively because the Welsh Government couldn't control enough levers within the justice system to make it work. The other case study is on police apprenticeships, which I know is not very sexy, and I'm not, you know, but it's actually, what the interesting thing there is that the UK government is entirely reliant on the Welsh Government's goodwill and, frankly, forbearance to exercise its responsibilities. You know, nobody can make policy very effectively in this area. It's also a system that's very poorly scrutinised and at best only weakly accountable. One just point in passing, and I want to emphasise this because it's easy perhaps to misunderstand what we're claiming. We're not claiming that the really poor outcomes that we find in Wales are a direct result of the constitutional arrangements that underpin the criminal justice system in Wales. You know, to prove that one way or the other would involve a very different kind of book. It's not at all clear that we could find the evidence. You know, Rob has basically been FOIing for 10 years to get us to where we are here. This has been a labour of, he doesn't really have a social life. He does FOIs in lieu of a social life. So I don't think we could even write that book. But what we think is irrefutable is that if you were serious about bringing about a systematic improvement in Wales in terms of criminal justice outcomes, so actually having fewer people in the system, fewer wasted lives, lowering recidivism rates, and all these kinds of things, which, you know, common sense would suggest you would want, you're not going to do that while these constitutional structures remain in place, right? So we're not claiming, because we can't claim, that the poor outcomes are the result of these constitutional arrangements, which are clearly unorthodox, unparalleled. But we are saying that if you wanted to do something about the problems, you will not be able to do it within this constitutional structure. Rob, next, please. And so therefore, finally, and thank you for your forbearance, spoken a little bit too long. So, you know, where does this leave us? So, obviously, in 2019, as I'm sure you're all aware, and one of you was involved directly, so at least one of you was involved directly, the Commission on Justice in Wales, chaired by the former Lord Chief Justice, John Thomas, they unanimously concluded that we're being let down by the current arrangements. They argued for devolution of justice, saying it would enable the proper alignment of justice policy with social, health, education policies, and actually it would allow you to try and develop long-term solutions, place justice at the heart of government, which I think is a really important principle. And I think, you know, this week of all weeks, I think we see why that's important. It would also enable clearer and much improved accountability. The truth of the matter is that there was no serious engagement from the UK government to the results, to the reports. the report was the response was entirely dismissive, insultingly so. Actually, lots of Welsh Labour MPs, or those who have shared their views, seem to agree with them. And what we've seen is kind of trivialization. So, you know, most egregiously, the then head of HMPPS, when confronted with the fact that we've got the highest imprisonment rates in Western Europe, said it's worse in Guernsey, right? Guernsey has 100 people in prison. It has a population that is smaller than Ynys Môn. In fact, that is smaller than Wrexham County Borough, where they've built a prison which will become Western Europe's second biggest prison. Okay, that was the result. Not maybe we should understand what's going on here. Yes, well, that's worrying, isn't it? What's going on? It was complete dismissive, you know, absolutely you know, outrageous response. They decried devolution. They kind of seem to claim that this couldn't possibly work, even though this is, you know, what we have is the unorthodox approach. Devolving justice alongside the devolved government and a devolved legislature. That's the tried and tested method of dealing with this, or deflection. So we saw a number of MPs saying, well, the issue is distances and that prisoners are being kept at distances from their families, which leads to higher rates of recidivism, which is all true, but that is actually a function of having a single England and Wales criminal justice system where you keep prisoners is not, you know, the distance from home is not a priority. So basically, there has been no serious response to the report of the Commission on Justice in Wales, no logical evidenced attempt to undermine the recommendations, simply dismissal. So at the moment, we are where we are. We've got a situation where we have a system that's failing very badly on any kind of measure, that is systematically dysfunctional, that the Welsh government would like to see devolve, but it's not clear it can even persuade its own party colleagues of the case. A UK government that doesn't want to move. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this book is you know, try and engage our academic colleagues, try and engage civil society in Wales. I mean, if you're serious about kind of social policy, you know, you need, and you're serious about housing policy, for example, you can't simply ignore the criminal justice dimensions. Similarly, health. If you're serious about mental health, for example, you know, criminal justice and mental health mesh in all kinds of ways. You can't have a serious conversation about mental health services in Wales without engaging with the criminal justice system. So what we're trying to do is bring forward evidence and try and engage as many people as we can, accepting that as academics, there are obvious limits to what we can achieve. And with that, I'll stop.